The famous writer and psychiatrist M. Scott Peck used to say that if you need therapy and you can't afford it, to pretend to be an alcoholic and go to AA meetings. And he gave that advice in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, but the truth is that Alcoholics Anonymous has done a masterful job of distilling some of the greatest psychological truths that we have into nice, pithy little proverbs that our sometimes rather pickled members can remember. When I was in my doctoral program at Vanderbilt, a part of my training involved being the chaplain on the drug and alcohol treatment ward in the VA hospital. And not all of our patients were there by choice. Some of them were either going to go to jail or go into treatment. So we had a number of guys on our floor that we could call reluctant participants in our recovery program. It was part of my job to run the intake group meeting on Monday. We'd put brand new patients in with some guys that had been around for a few weeks and try to get them introduced to how the system works and start to get to know them and hear their story. And we had this one old veteran, I'll call him Buddy, who had been in our program for a couple of months and he hadn't said a single word in any meeting. He was just there. He got to sleep inside and get 3 meals a day, and that was about all he wanted from us. But he knew he had to go to the meetings. He'd sit there and slump down, pull a ball cap down over his face and snooze until the whole thing was over. But one day in intake, we had a new vet, young guy that was sharing maybe a little too much about himself and talking about how alcohol had ruined his life, that he had been discharged from the Army, divorced, and was now homeless. But when he said that he'd gotten to the point that he was drinking 8 beers a day, Buddy sat up, pushed up his cap, and said, 8? I spill that much before breakfast. And then pulled his cap back down, and that was the last we heard out of Buddy. Buddy was doing something that we see a lot in recovery programs. There's a not too subtle competition for who has the biggest tales to tell about how much they drank and how wild their behaviors were when they were drunk, including all of the lurid, sexual, illegal, and car crash details of their proud life as a drunk. Sometimes a meeting absolutely goes off the rails with everyone trying to best the last person's story, all of which starts to sound like they really miss their drinking days much more than they are enjoying their sobriety. To counter this very unproductive line of conversation, AA has a great proverb, and it says this: don't tell us how sick you've been, tell us how well you want to be. Just that sentence dropped in a meeting that's gone totally off the rails can steer the ship back in the right direction. Way too much of medicine, of psychology, and I'm going to say religion, is focused on illness rather than being focused on health. It's focused on neuroses rather than on talent. It's focused on sin rather than on virtue. We all know the name of Abraham Maslow from his famous introduction of the pyramid, that hierarchy of needs. It's a helpful model. It points out that generally speaking, we can focus on social connections or personal accomplishment only after we have met certain survival and safety needs. But his famous hierarchy of needs, in my opinion, is not his most important contribution to the field of psychology. Abraham Maslow recognized that most of psychology up to that point was focused on fixing what was wrong with people rather than spending time and energy in encouraging what was already right in their lives. Rather than supporting their strengths, we were constantly trying to quash their weaknesses or their failings. It seems like an obvious point, but no one ever schedules an appointment to go see a counselor to tell them that their marriage is going just great, the kids are excelling in school, they sleep like a baby at night, and they're exhausted from all the great sex they're having. People come to counseling because of the opposite of one or two or three of those things. And so we tend to spend time talking about people's problems and forget about their strengths, their talents, their successes, which inevitably is where they're going to be able to become healthy again. If you strengthen where they're healthy, you can take care of the other problems. All neuroses are a replacement for legitimate suffering. Almost every mental illness can be traced back to an avoidance of something that you need to address more positively. So why spend all of your time on the weaknesses rather than on the strengths where you can pull yourself out of those holes? Todd Scheibel, the director of our Borough Mental Health Center here in Springfield, used to tell us in board meetings about when he kept going to the hardware store trying to get another kind of weed killer, something to get the weeds out of his lawn to have a better looking lawn. And after several failures and frustrated trips to the hardware store, one of those sage old wise men that you know work in the back of hardware stores said, "Son, you need to quit worrying about killing weeds and start worrying about growing grass. Plant good seeds, water them, fertilize them, and let the weeds take care of themselves." The field of medicine could learn a lot of valuable lessons from that old guy at the hardware store. We would all be healthier if we focused on eating good foods, exercising, and avoiding toxins than we will ever become by taking prescription pharmaceuticals to always treat the symptoms of our illnesses. We need to quit trying to kill weeds and work harder on growing grass. We need to stop obsessing about how sick we have been and focus on how healthy we want to be. Treatment can actually become its own reward. We have a saying in the South. I remember my parents being able to say it, Aunt Sally is enjoying ill health right now. People can start to believe that their illnesses make them interesting. And why wouldn't they? You look at how much attention they get from educated professionals just for being sick. Look at how many television commercials are aimed at illness and dysfunction. I know from my own pastoral counseling practice that there are people who would come to see me once or twice every week for the rest of their lives if I would allow them to. There are people who nurture their psychological distress for the attention and sympathy that it gets them. In counseling, I try my best to be sympathetic and encouraging, but I always try to remember that the goal is health, not another appointment. I'm not a chiropractor, after all. We would like for this to wrap up and for you to move on. I want to help people to strengthen what's going right with their lives so they can get back to the business of growing grass rather than constantly trying to poison weeds. I'm allowing myself to realize the degree to which we've been guilty of this same malady in the progressive religious movement. How easy would it be for you, if you just met someone that was a churchgoer somewhere, for you to describe your spiritual life to them without using any negative illustrations? Maybe it was necessary at some point to identify ourselves by saying what we are not, that we don't believe in magic and superstition. We're not like churches that have creedal statements or assertions of truth about invisible things like angels and demons and heaven and hell and souls. And we don't believe in God-inspired or written religious texts. We have decried the irrational religious beliefs that inspire terrorism, that demean women, that condemn homosexuals, that provoke international wars, that diminishes even the importance of taking care of our environment. We've separated ourselves from the criminal institutions, literally, that exploit the weak-minded, taking their money while covering up for their own sexual and financial crimes. We reject the neurotic guilt and sexual fear generated by their silly religious assertions. But we can become just like those old veterans sitting in a treatment center, swapping stories about how crazy, malignant, and deceptive our past church experiences have been. I think it's time for us to stop obsessing about how sick we've been and find it easier to talk about how healthy we want to be. Martin Luther King Jr. famously challenged churches to be the headlights of society rather than the taillights. But most of the time, we're just really good at being taillights. We will protest engaging in another war. We will object to another oil pipeline or fracking or coal-burning plants. We've decried police brutality and racial profiling. We've rallied against anti-union policies and restrictive health care policies. But folks, can't we be more than the loyal opposition? If you look back in time, you can see that most religions actually began as liberation movements. Zoroastrianism began among Persian slaves seeking justice from their oppressors. The Buddha left a wealthy royal family to live in poverty and to teach others a life of compassion. Moses was a liberator of slaves. Jesus went to the poor and the outcast of Israel. Muhammad sought to unite the warring tribes and personally lived in poverty all of his life. Muhammad, unlike the people who followed him, Muhammad lived in a tiny house and wore shabby clothes till the day that he died, encouraging his followers to always have sensitivity to the poor and compassion to those that were hungry. And I hope you'll never get tired of hearing me repeat that the Buddha insisted that he was not a god, though his followers keep trying to deify him. Muhammad demanded that no human was divine, though many people in the Muslim world treat Muhammad as if he were divine. They'll deny it tooth and toenail and yet treat even his name and his memory as if he were. I personally believe that the historical Jesus insisted that he was not a god, but later generations heaped up divine titles on Jesus and other deceased heroes to make them seem like they were more important. However, trying to push any human being up onto a pedestal and throw roses at them effectively silences them. As soon as you deify anyone, their message gets lost. Confucius, Buddha, Zoroaster, Jesus, Muhammad all taught a way of life, and then institutional religion tried to turn them into a set of beliefs. What we in the progressive movement are trying to do is recapture the relevance of the message, the positive aspects of how being a spiritual person can bring light into a dark world. A lot of people are discouraged by the loss of supernatural theism because they've had supernatural theism hammered into them all their lives. They're told that, you pray enough, God's going to answer your prayers, that God's like a Santa Claus that comes 12 months out of the year instead of just once. How could they not be disappointed to lose that? Still, though, if you look back at even American history, there are reasons why we have so many hospitals with religious names. Don't you know why there's a Jewish hospital, a Baptist hospital, a St. John's? Even our Cox was originally Methodist hospital, a Deacon's hospital, a Sisters of Mercy hospital. Because there was a time when religious people realized that the poor were not being given health care. And almost every one of those hospitals started as a compassionate, direct outreach to the poor who needed care. Now, what they have become in later generations is like a dragon compared to how they started, but they started when religious people realized they needed to be proactive to do something to change the face of society. The civil rights movement was cradled in black churches in the South. At the time of the civil rights movement's beginnings, in the late 50s and early 60s, America was ripe for a race-based civil war, a war that could have ended up with everybody losing. But the civil rights movement, rooted in black churches, was committed to a nonviolent protest. Now, I admire the way Martin Luther King looked at what Gandhi did and tried to import nonviolent protest into the black community. But let's look at some basic facts here. Gandhi was able to provide nonviolent protest in India, where he represented 90% of the people. Their oppressors were in a rank minority. So by sheer numbers of bodies, they could lead a nonviolent protest and win. When the civil rights movement in the United States started, the black population was, 10% of America. They were grossly outnumbered by their oppressors and still devoted themselves conscientiously, deliberately, that when we're struck, we're not going to strike back. When they turn the dogs on us, we're not going to fight back. When they shoot at us, we're not going to shoot back. They decided they were going to take the moral high ground, and ultimately they won. So sure, we're against war. The progressive religious people, we're against war. We're against racism. We're in favor of peace. But what do we do to work for peace, to plan for peace, to sacrifice for peace? It's not enough once we're sending troops to amass on the border of another country to be against the war then. We have to be against war way in advance. I want to go on record right now as being opposed to the next war. I want to figure out what we can do to actually create bonds of unity across international borders, across races, across languages, across cultures and religions, to make war irrelevant and unnecessary. We're against poverty, but we can't make enough noise just writing letters to the editor in the opinion section of the newspaper. We need to work on the complicated task of creating better jobs with better salaries and closing the gap between the haves and the have-nots. We despise racism and sexism and homophobia and gender bias and unequal pay for women, but for God's sake, doesn't the church that speaks of community and fellowship and claims to be full of brothers and sisters, don't we know how to break down the walls between blacks and whites, between Latinos and Asians, between the straight and the gay community, the queer and the transgender folks? Are we just against prejudice, or are we in favor of love? I was never a big fan of the self-help book, Your Erroneous Zones, but there was one line in it that I just can't let go of. The author begged readers to stop dwelling on the dysfunction of their families. Because if we asked how many of us grew up in dysfunctional families, to raise your hands, the wind would put out the candles up here on the communion table. Yeah, we oftentimes had less than adequate parents. Our experiences of life may be full of hardship and betrayal. But the author of Your Erroneous Zone said, so what if your mother beat you? She's not beating you now. I don't want to diminish anyone's painful history. I don't want to be dismissive of how abusive religion can be and certainly has been in my own past. I just don't want to keep renting space in my skull to that stuff. Don't call me a hypocrite the next time you see me pulling religious weeds, but I'm just saying that I think it's time, maybe it's past time, for us to start focusing on growing more grass and let the weeds take care of themselves. Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Reverend Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.